So Jonathan, can you tell me a bit more about Craiglockhart?
Yeah, so Craiglockhart, which is a big country house just outside Edinburgh, in Victorian times it was a place associated with hydrotherapy, where people went to take the waters. So during the First World War, it became a special hospital for traumatised soldiers. And there were a variety of different approaches to treatment used there. Some of our learners may be familiar with Pat Barker's novel Regeneration, or indeed the movie that was made out of it, and that explores rather well these different treatments. There was a Dr. Yelland who believed in electroshock therapy. Then there was Dr. Rivers who believed in the talking cure, and there was Dr. Brock, Arthur Brock, who believed in what he called ergotherapy, which was therapy through work, what we might now call occupational therapy, sort of physical activity. Rivers had read deeply in Sigmund Freud, and he believed in the curative power of talk, what we would now call psychoanalysis. But he wasn't a Freudian in the sense of thinking that sexual trauma was the key to things. With these soldiers, it was to do with reliving and thus, in some senses, expiating the trauma of what they had seen and experienced in the trenches. And Brock, as I say, was a really important figure because he got the patients out there working on local farms, going into schools, and he also encouraged them to write, to produce a magazine. So there was a magazine called The Hydra, and the work on that he thought was a very important part of the therapy.
And of course, one of the most famous inmates, if you like, was Siegfried Sassoon.
Yeah, that's right. So, I mean, the story of how Sassoon got to Craiglockhart is an interesting one because Sassoon, who was a very brave officer, but he reached a point at which he really felt he needed to speak out against the war. He just thought the carnage was too much. The war could no longer be justified. But of course, for a serving officer to speak out against the war, this was treason. This was grounds for a court-martial. So he was in severe trouble. His friend, Robert Graves, had found out about the work of Rivers at Craiglockhart. I think in the discussion with Andrew, I incorrectly said Graves had been treated at Craiglockhart. That wasn't actually the case. But he knew about Rivers. And what Graves decided was that he would persuade the court-martial that Sassoon was suffering from shell shock so that he wouldn't be court-martialed and shot. And there's a famous passage in Robert Graves's great autobiographical memoir of his experience in the First World War, Goodbye to All That, where he talks about this moment, and I've got it here. Sassoon, says Graves, looked very ill. He told me he had just been down to the Formby Links, that's a golf course just near Liverpool, where you come from, and thrown his military cross into the sea. We discussed the political situation. I took the line that everyone was mad except ourselves and one or two others, and that no good could come of offering common sense to the insane. At last, unable to deny how ill he was, Siegfried consented to appear before the medical board. Much against my will, I had to appear in the role of a patriot distressed by the mental collapse of a brother in arms, a collapse directly due to his magnificent exploits in the trenches. I mentioned Siegfried's hallucinations in the matter of corpses in Piccadilly. Being in nearly as bad a state of nerves as Siegfried myself, I burst into tears 3 times during my statement. I prayed that when Siegfried came into the boardroom after me, he would not undo my work by appearing too sane. Well, the trick worked, and Sassoon was duly sent to Craiglockhart. Graves accompanied him there, and he met Rivers. And so Sassoon found himself in this environment full of these soldiers suffering from shell shock.
He was so brave. He did win the military cross. And who did he meet when he was at Craiglockhart?
Well, he met Wilfred Owen, who seriously was suffering from shell shock. And it was there, of course, that Sassoon encouraged Owen to write more explicitly about the war. Owen had been writing poetry for a long time, but the idea of writing poems that were really upfront about the trauma of the war, that was inspired by Sassoon. So many of Wilfred Owen's greatest poems, for example, Dulce et decorum est, the poem that ends with the line about the old lie that it is a beautiful and sweet thing to die for your country, these were written at Craiglockhart. Some of both Owen's and Sassoon's poems were published in Hydra, the in-house magazine there.
How closely did Sassoon edit Wilfred Owen?
Yeah, they did work extremely closely together. So you have surviving manuscripts there in the British Library in London of some of Owen's most famous poems, where Sassoon has put markings on them, has contributed to that process. We've been looking at some old footage from one of the other hospitals for shell-shock victims. Extraordinary footage of before and after. It has to be said, scholars have questioned some of that footage. It has been suggested that the patients were actually sort of reenacting their symptoms, rather like some of the famous footage of soldiers going over the top in the war, which was actually sort of filmed in retrospect. So we need to be a little bit careful with that evidence. But nevertheless, it does give an extraordinary sense of shell shock being a physical condition as well as a mental one.
And they'd never seen anything like it before on such a scale. The doctors were puzzled when they saw soldiers with these symptoms, hence why they had to do something about it. Of course, they had to get them back onto the front and get them well again. But it was a shock as much to the doctors as to anybody else, because it hadn't been seen on that scale.
And of course, this was an age where ideas of bravery, of the stiff upper lip, of duty, of patriotism was so important. So the sense of a soldier becoming like a child, being frightened, showing emotion, and of a body collapsing. This was, by some of the military top brass, regarded as rank cowardice. And so for the doctors to show that this was something real, something that the men were not in control of, and something that demanded treatment, demanded sympathy, was of enormous importance. And really the modern understanding of what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder began there.
But I want to sort of move away from, for a moment, that notion of PTSD being entirely to do with soldiers, with men in the First World War, because we have a better understanding now of trauma, and trauma can affect all sorts of people, as we know. It can affect women who've been raped or had miscarriages or stillbirths, and I think there are some very powerful poems about trauma. I mean, one of the poems we've been looking at dates, it's a Catherine Phillips poem from the 17th century, and she writes about miscarriage. And it seems to me as relevant, as fresh, as painful, about the trauma of losing yet another 15th or 16th baby. And so that's something that we've been looking at. And indeed, I went to speak to two people who'd experienced PTSD to talk about their experiences with them and how writing had helped them come to terms with their experience.
Yeah, I mean, of course, you're absolutely right. I mean, any kind of sudden shock can be a form of trauma. I mean, people who are involved in terrorist attacks, in accidents, but also, as you say, sort of less high profile, more private traumas. This is something that people experience, and of course the experience itself is not new. That a language for it emerged in the First World War, and now there is a modern medical understanding of it. But writers throughout history have been able to explore trauma. You give the example of Catherine Phillips, a woman writing about the trauma of miscarriage, of stillbirth. Shakespeare too clearly is fascinated by trauma. The film of his tragedy of war and indeed lost children, Macbeth, is a really good example of interpreting extreme behaviour in Shakespearean characters by way of PTSD. This is the film with Michael Fassbender as Macbeth, Marion Cotillard as Lady Macbeth. It begins with an image of a dead child. We know that the Macbeths have had a child but have lost it, and whereas other characters in the play do have children, the Macbeths don't. And we know too that Macbeth has had an extraordinarily violent time in battle. So the director of that film version sort of took the idea that Macbeth is suffering from battlefield stress and Lady Macbeth from trauma due to the loss of a child, and that this was a way of exploring the characters psychologically.
But there's also, I mentioned rape. Can you talk a little bit about Titus?
Yeah, I mean, Titus was Shakespeare's first tragedy, his bloodiest play, and certainly if you want trauma, it's there in abundance. This is the play that includes the stage direction, enter a messenger with 2 heads and a hand. Titus is a warrior, a soldier. He comes back from the wars, and then he's faced with appalling catastrophes as his sons are beheaded. He cuts off his own hand to try and save their life, but then his hand is brought back to him. And at one point, he's so traumatized on seeing this absolute sort of catalogue of dismemberment that all he can do is laugh. Very astute on Shakespeare's part, the idea that in times of extremity, words can fail us, and only some kind of hollow laugh is possible. But another moment in the play comes where Titus's brother, Marcus, witnesses Lavinia, his niece, the daughter of Titus. She's been raped, and then the rapists have cut off her hands and cut out her tongue, so she cannot identify who's done it. And Marcus witnesses her, and he produces this rather beautiful, rather strange speech describing her body. So some people find this rather distasteful, that he speaks beautiful poetry at a time of great trauma. But what Shakespeare seems to be suggesting is that it's almost like a sort of slow motion effect, that Marcus is trying to comprehend what he's seeing, this beautiful young girl who has been so hideously violated and mutilated. He's slowly trying to come to terms with it, as if he's witnessing a bad dream and realizing it's a reality.